Thank you very much, Saqib, and thank you to the organizers of the conference and to everyone that I've had a chance to chat with so far. I just had a very inspiring conversation about different perspectives and different sources and different approaches in Quranic studies, and that's going to make me feel better about the fact that my work is based upon what we can call tafsīr studies within Western Quranic studies, and connected within the general study of tafsīr and usul al-tafsīr. This is going back to my PhD work on what is known as tafsīr al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. Broadly speaking, we can define as explaining any part of the Qur'an with reference to other parts. So we can say reading the Qur'an contextually, whether it's the immediate context or other verses within the corpus or the wider context of the whole Qur'an. So my thesis of some 7 years ago is being followed up, gradually and slowly developing, composition history happening as you watch, of my monograph with Edinburgh University Press. And I had taken Surah al-Anʿām, chapter 6, as a case study to look at the engagement of a group of exegetes on this surah. And now I'm looking at it again after having presented it according to some thematic observations. I'm now trying to compose more of a linear commentary based on this principle of reading the Qur'an on its own terms or reading it in an interconnected way. And the examiners, one of them is in the room actually, had pointed out that perhaps my own voice was missing in the earlier version of my work, and I felt that was right as a doctoral student, but maybe it will come out in the book. I won't explain to you just now my artwork here. This is actually done in Photoshop, not AI, so I spent longer on it than you think. This is a little bit of historical overview. We don't need to spend much on this, but Tafsīr al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, has been talked about in theory by a number of writers in Islamic hermeneutics, and this is just a sample of those that I've identified. And then the practice of reading the Qur'an in interconnected ways and making connections between verses is of course something quite ubiquitous in works of tafsir, and here are some examples or where it is particularly prominent or done in a more interesting way. And a lot of that really happens in the modern age, in the 20th century, where this emerged more as a distinct genre, and you start to find more works that have set out to be works of tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. This is a quick summary of things which I have identified as types of citations that you can find in tafsir works. So I like to think of this as two categories. The first is parallels, and that might be something which is an identical verse, right? If you want to call it a doublet, you can. And if you want to think of it also as a verse which is similar but slightly different, then we enter into that other genre of the mutashabihat that was also touched on earlier. So why do they mention these parallels? This is just some reasons I won't go into too much just now. But also, the exegetes will cite verses by way of evidence for what they're saying, some perspective, some interpretation, perhaps some kind of legal point that is following from the verse, and other things will be cited to support it. And when they do this, then, they are making connections between the verses, connections which may not show up on a computer program, but connections which are based on the type of study that the exegetes were doing with the Quranic text. This is a reflection that I wanted to share with you, just some very, very quick ideas about how intra-Quranic or tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an can be useful and can be thought about in, can you guess what HCQS is? I was about to say hypercritical, what's it called? Historical critical Quranic studies. And I don't want to make a hard line between, what's on the left here, what's on the right here as the tafsir versus Quranic studies, but just a very indicative sort of starting point. So in tafsir, people are doing this aiming at the meanings and the rulings from the verses. In Quranic studies, of course, more broadly, we may also be thinking about compilation history. That's a lot of what we're talking about in these days. In tafsir, this would be based upon certain principles which stem from the assumption and the belief that the Qur'an is revealed by God, and that would say something about the authority of the text, the unity of the text, the consistency that this is a non-contradiction within the text, and these are things on which the process of comparing the verses and combining them can be built. But more generally, appreciating context, appreciating the time scale in which these verses exist can also be a basis for reading the Qur'an in this way. In the tafsir tradition, this type of study is largely synchronic. I don't know who said it, but I like the image someone has mentioned of, it's as if the Mufassirs are all sitting around the table and talking together, and we talk about them in that way oftentimes in works of tafsir, as if they aren't, spread out over centuries and working individually on their own projects and in their own contexts. But largely also in tafsir, when they are comparing verses, there isn't a direct focus on which one is earlier or later, except in some cases, which I will actually focus on in a bit. They will cite verses according to need, according to what comes to mind. When it comes to parallels, you might see in Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, for example, under a verse, he'll just mention a couple of things which perhaps came to his mind that are resembling verses. It wasn't necessarily done in a systematic way, which is something open to us to do, and there have been some attempts to build concordances, and computers, I'm sure, can do something in this as well. And when I mentioned about the modern approach to Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, this has emerged within a certain context and according to certain needs and concerns, and sometimes is being promoted as something which aims at a higher level of objectivity, where people will say, I'm reading the Qur'an on its own terms. For example, I'm allowing the Qur'an to speak. They will use terms like this. They are also concerned with coherence, so trying to see within the structure of a surah or within the Qur'an as a whole, to defend the Qur'an perhaps against this view of incoherence. And also they see it as a way to be minimalistic, that is to say, to focus on the Qur'an rather than external sources which inform our interpretation or which push it in certain directions. And more generally, and this is not exclusive to the right-hand side, this is going to compete with various external contexts and intertexts, whether that be reading against the backdrop of the Seerah, whether it be against the backdrop of late antiquity. So I had focused on Surah al-An'am. These are the reasons that I had at the time. I wanted something lengthy enough. I didn't want a sort of superficial analysis, so I wanted something long enough. Being late Meccan, I felt, okay, that fits roughly in the middle of the revelation period, so there might be things going backwards, there might be things going forwards, so that works okay. But also a couple of curious things about An'am that stood out. When I looked at, TQQ means Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, when I looked at the hadith which existed with regards to this, that according to these narrations, the Prophet himself has explained the Qur'an with reference to another verse, both the cases which exist in the Sahih collections, right, so authenticated hadith, have to do with al-An'am. I don't know why specifically, but that's the case. Also, if you look within the Qur'an for where there are explicit cross-references, both the ones that I am aware of are related to al-An'am. So again, just interesting. So I thought, let's dive into this surah to find out more about it. This just tells you something about the approach that I took, so you'll understand later if I mention these names. These are some of the Mufassirs that have taken a Qur'an primary or Qur'an only kind of approach. And then these are some other supplementary resources that I pulled citations from. Just to keep in mind that the idea of Tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an is not limited to citing another verse, but citations was a way that I could quantify what connections that they are making between one verse and another. And this resulted in something which then I summarized in the appendix of my thesis, which is a citations corpus for Surah An'am. And what you can see here basically over 17 pages is under each verse, what are the things that were considered to be parallels by this group of exegetes, and what are the things that they cited also as evidence. So perhaps this is something that could be fruitful as a way of mining the insights of the exegetes. Right, so next steps. What I found among various other things was that in this set of exegeses, which are based primarily upon the Qur'an, the conclusions that they reached tended to be the same conclusions that you can find in the rest of tafsir. So there wasn't much revolutionary happening with regards to their results. In fact, you would even find that the Sunni ones found that the Quran is Sunni and the Shia ones found that the Quran is Shia. So everything was okay because they found ways to explain and justify their positions based on other verses. I had made a lot of problem in my thesis of the idea of agency. The way that some people would talk about the Quran I found very problematic. One of those is the Quran explains itself. Al-Qur'ānu yufassiru ba'duhu ba'dan. The Quran explains itself. And generally, my point was to argue that this is not how it works. What happens is that a Mufassir explains the Quran using the Quran. We have to be very cognizant of the agency of the interpreter. However, what I thought could deserve further exploration is the idea of revelations which came successively by way of clarification and explanation. Right? So this is a concept which is well known to you, but maybe hasn't been identified within the tafsir tradition as something which I might term divine tafsir, right? The idea that in a way a question has arisen based on an earlier verse, so then a question then circulates and then revelation comes to answer that question, right? So this concept is well known, but maybe not with a clear term. And then listening and reflecting also on some of the things that were being shared before, particularly by Joe with regards to the editorial process, I got starting to think about divine editing, but that's probably for the next conference. So here are some diachronic aspects of Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran that I wanted to home in on with some examples from Surah 6. So these are the places where the time of revelation actually matters. One of them, of course, is abrogation, where a later verse is seen as replacing or cancelling out an earlier one. Cross-references and prophetic linkages, as I mentioned before. I should confess that mostly in what I've gathered here, I'm looking at Surah al-Anʿām as Mufassar, that is to say explained by something else, rather than the other part of it, where al-Anʿām could be doing this to other surahs. I should also clarify that abrogation is a kind of tafsir, I would argue. It's not necessarily thought of that way all the time. But the claim of an abrogation is that, in a way, God has revealed something which has explained to us that we should not take the previous verse at face value, and that we should understand and modify our perception of that first verse as being something that was of limited operationability. You choose a real word for that one, right? So of limited use and of limited applicability, right? That would work. So this is the idea of abrogation. In these cases, it is necessary to know the times of revelation, or otherwise it is inferred from the text based on the content that it should be this way around based on the fact that it looks like one has replaced the other. And generally, as well, it's important to know that when, especially the early scholars used the term naskh, they did not necessarily mean abrogation in the way that would later be understood as a technical meaning, but they may have just been referring to various ways that later texts modify our understanding of earlier texts, and generally the sense of progression from one thing to another. So in Surah al-An'am, in Ibn al-Jawzi's collection, Nawasikh al-Quran, there are 18 verses which are said to be cancelled. 13 of them were cancelled by the sword verse. I'm going to conveniently leave that aside for the moment. But there's 5 examples then that are not to do with jihad and the sword verse. And some of these might be a bit surprising. There's a point of view of Muqatil, a very early exegete, that say, I fear the punishment of a dreadful day if I disobey my Lord. This is abrogated by the reassurance that God will forgive Muhammad, peace be upon him, his past and future sins. Right? So here there's some discussion about what does that earlier verse in particular mean? How does this claim of abrogation then affect our interpretation of it? Right? So some ended up saying that no, there is no contradiction here or abrogation. Al-Maturidi said, rather, the fact that he is forgiven is because he has this fear. So being fearful is actually a part of being a good believer and being a sincere seeker of God, right? Then we have this verse, obviously related to some things that were discussed earlier, about eating the meat over which God's name has not been pronounced. It has been understood variously as referring specifically to the things on which the names of pagan deities have been pronounced. But some have said perhaps it includes also things that people just forgot to mention God's name on. So this is called matruk at-tasmiyah. So then there could be an abrogation when the permission is given of the food of those given the scripture, because they are not necessarily pronouncing God's name in the same way, right? But a lot of this is to do with how you interpret each of the verses, therefore understanding the relationship between them. The third one I'll just pass over for time. And then you've got this example of the ashud, stay well away from the properties of orphans except with the best intentions until they come of age, the ashud. And then there is another verse in An-Nisa, until they reach the age of nikah. So As-Suddi's view is ashud means 30 years old and therefore was abrogated by nikah. Others say no, they just mean the same thing. Or in other words, that this one has come to explain this one. So once it's understood that a marriageable age is intended, then we know what the ashud was in the preceding verse. Now this one is slightly more important in a way for what will follow. In al-An'ām we have this verse which says, when you, happens to be singular, when you come across people who speak with scorn about our revelations, turn away from them until they move on to another topic. And then there is a following verse, the righteous are not in any way held accountable for the wrongdoers. Their only duty is to remind them so that they may be mindful of God. So in Surat An-Nisa 4:140, we have a verse which then says, as he has already revealed to you in the scripture. This is also one of the cross-references, right? As he's already revealed to you, if you hear people denying and ridiculing God's revelation, do not sit with them unless they start to talk of other things. So you might wonder, where is the abrogation here? I wondered too. The reason that some of them said there's abrogation here is rather to do with this part. Because it seems to imply that if you do, then you're not really accountable for what the wrongdoers get up to and what they say and how they mock. And then here, if you do so, you yourselves will be like them, has then overruled that kind of permission. Okay? But generally, this has been responded to by other scholars who said, well, this is actually saying, this part here in al-An'ām, is saying that if you walk away from them and leave them to their devices, you're not responsible for the fact that you weren't there telling them about God's signs and informing them. If they want to do what they do, you leave them to it. Otherwise, you will be like them. So this is a complementary verse and a reinforcing verse rather than an abrogating one. So here we come to the cross-references. As we've just mentioned, 4:140 is reinforcing 6:68. And then we have a verse in An-Nahl, we forbade to the Jews what we have recounted to you earlier. وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا مَا قَصَصْنَا عَلَيْكَ مِنْ قَبْلِ. What we recounted to you earlier. So this is generally taken to reference what is mentioned in al-An'ām, every animal with claws and the fat of cattle and sheep. So this would then mean that we are seeing An-Nahl as a later revelation than al-An'ām, which is indeed maintained by plenty of scholars. In Surah al-An'ām, we have this verse, which Joe was highlighting earlier. وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِّرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. He has already fully explained what he has forbidden you. So here the scholars go in a few directions. So At-Tabari, for example, mentions the verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah. And you can see immediately what could be the problem of this. So Muhammad al-Amin Shinqiti, he quotes that and says, well, it can't be Al-Ma'idah because Al-Ma'idah is, of course, Medinan, and it's later. So he says, well, it's verse 145, al-An'ām. And then he doesn't go into what's the obvious problem in that. which is that it's later in the same surah, right? It's later in the same surah. So I got thinking now after Joe's presentation about a few directions that we can go in this. I'll come to in a moment. But some others said, well, this is An-Nahl, verse 115. Of course, a problem that we can have with that is then we have cross-references going in two directions between these two surahs. And then that raises just some questions about how to understand the way that these things have proceeded, the timings of what's involved. Ibn Ashur, 20th century exegete, has said, actually this is probably referring to some non-Quranic revelation. So even you have been told what is forbidden, but this is not referring to anything in the Qur'an. This could actually be a quite handy solution. We had the theory about this being a later addition. We also had the possibility of the question of, was al-An'am revealed in a nanosecond? Now, if it was revealed all at once, maybe we can reevaluate the sense of وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ as being essentially a preparation for the fact that you are about to hear what is going to come. Just, 26 verses later on, right? So this would be the possibility that I'm just going to throw out there. So is the Nahl earlier or later? Here's another, piece of evidence that could be useful. Ash-Shinqiti notices that in al-An'ām we have the ones who have associated will say سَيَقُولُ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا, and then this statement is exactly mirrored in al-Nahl, and the ones who have associated وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا, and then much the same thing is said. So is this a clincher of an evidence? Maybe not. Ibn Ashur says, for example, if we saw it the other way around, it could be interpreted just as being, they've said it and they're going to keep saying it. Right? سَيَقُولُ could mean keep saying it. So, of course, the exegetes find solutions for various types of possibilities that come up. The last area is the prophetic linkages made between al-An'ām and other surahs. And as it happens, both times to the same surah. And that is Q31, Luqman. Right? There are very few explicit hadiths of this kind, even if we included things that are graded as less than sahih. There are very few things that are explicit in this regard in the hadith tradition. One of them pertains to verse 59. He has the keys to the unseen, mafatihul ghaib. Mafatih can also mean openings to the unseen. And then in the hadith, the keys to the unseen are 5. And then the rest of the hadith is simply a quotation from the end of Luqman. Knowledge of the hour belongs to God. It is He who sends down the relieving rain. He who knows what is hidden in the womb. No soul knows what it will reap tomorrow, or in what land it will die. So those are the 5 things which are, according to the hadith, the mafatih al-ghaib. And that can be a little bit disappointing, because in al-An'ām, you have this very broad universal statement, and then you have a hadith which tells you just 5. And in fact, some of the scholars said, well, these 5, so Tabatabai said in his Tafsīr al-Mīzān, these 5 are all basically the same thing, which is knowledge of future events. So it's not even all the keys to the unseen, it's all maybe within one key to the unseen, right? So then this can be explained as a hadith which gives tafsīr by way of example, right? Rather than attempting to limit the scope of the verse, it's saying, here are some things that fall under that meaning, right? This is the famous one. If you look at any section of any book about tafsīr al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an, they will quote this example. Although, in reality, in my argument, it is a case of prophetic tafsir more than it is a case of tafsīr al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. So, upon the revelation of الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ, in verse 82, just after the Abraham passage, or within the Abraham passage, you could say, the companions of the messenger found it onerous and said, which of us does not wrong himself? So they have understood that you are in jeopardy if you are a person of faith who does any dhulm, any wrongdoing, any sin. So the Messenger of God said, "It is not as you suppose. Rather, it is as Luqman said to his son, O my son, do not associate partners with God. Verily, shirk is a tremendous dhulm." Right? So shirk is a dhulm. So he's explained it this way in order to say what Abraham meant, or what God meant in commenting on this passage, is that you do not mix your belief with shirk, with association. So, a few things. Number one, the chronologies tend to place al-An'am before Luqman. So this slightly problematizes that issue. Some versions of the hadith indicate that the Luqman verse was revealed as clarification. And some others say that he tells them, "Have you not heard what Luqman said?" assuming that they have heard this before. Now, these are not huge problems, but they just tend to go a little bit unexplored in the tafsir literature. What could have happened, of course, is that people heard Surat al-An'ām, and then just a little bit later, maybe just 2 surahs later, Luqman comes as well. But then after that, they start to have this existential doubt, because they're reading al-An'ām a little bit later than its revelation, right? So the problem isn't just when it was revealed, but also when people are reading it and when people are thinking about it. So by that time, Luqman could well have been revealed, and this verse already exists. But why do I class this more as a prophetic tafsir rather than an intra-Quranic one? Partly because, in fact, the verse in Luqman doesn't really do anything to clarify the one in al-An'ām. Because if you look at it, verily, shirk is a tremendous dhulm, doesn't tell you that every mention of dhulm means shirk. Rather, to understand this well, you would have to look within the context of al-An'ām itself. So in the verse by itself, you find that الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ. So they do not mix their iman with dhulm. It would have to be the relevant type of dhulm that is in contrast with iman. So that would imply shirk. The entire contention between the two parties that Ibrahim is in this argument about was about shirk and idolatry and worship of the heavenly bodies. Al-Razi points this out. The indefinite dhulm, bi-dhulmin, suggests the greatest form of dhulm. This is an exegetical insight from al-Alusi in the 19th century. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali says, most Quranic warnings to the dhalimun pertain to the unbelievers. So this is a thematic reading of this vocabulary in the Qur'an. And generally, shirk is a very dominant theme in al-An'ām. It is the surah in which the word shirk and its derivatives come more often than any other surah. So here I agree with Az-Zarkashi that the Prophet must have understood this contextually rather than based on Luqman. And therefore, when he cited Luqman, it was to point out to people who might not understand it quite as quickly that, as you can see, the word dhulm is used in some places for shirk, and that's what's intended here. So I hope that, I think I'm within time, because Saqib has not indicated anything. So I'm done. I'm done? Yeah, thanks.